Just to start off with the issue, and I'm going to speak first and then turn it over to my colleagues. So I specialize in election law, not usually law and technology. But one of the issues that's emerged in recent years as of great legal and public policy importance, I would say, is the fact that political parties collect, store, use, analyze, and share large amounts of sensitive personal information about Canadian voters. Okay? And that is something that is not brand new, but still relatively new as a matter of political behavior, right? People studying political parties in the 70s didn't pay a lot of attention to the data game, right? That is now a fundamental part of politics. And the reason we're speaking to you today is particularly about the privacy implications, right? Because the privacy laws that apply to the public sector generally and to the private sector generally do not apply to political parties under current federal legislation. Okay? So they now use, collect, and store a huge amount of sensitive data without the usual privacy safeguards that we would expect of other large, significant, important actors in society. So that's really the core public policy issue that we want to frame for you today. I do want to start off first, though, talking about Donald Trump. What else can we do in 2017? So before the election, the US election, there was an article talking about Donald Trump's data game. And the people working for him in that respect claimed their goal was to have a profile of every single potential voter in the United States that would contain information about those individuals and also help predict their behavior. Right? Are they going to vote for Donald Trump or not? What messages will they be receptive to? Will they donate money? All those things that political parties care about. Okay, so the model of politics of being about the ground war, just knocking on doors, right, or the air war, just about advertisements on television, very outdated. And now the data war plays a prominent role. We've now seen since the election lots of triumphant crowing about, we won, Trump won because of the data operation, and the various companies and players involved in that claiming that they played the decisive role, right? We can't determine whether causally that's correct, right? But the data war playing a huge role in contemporary politics now. So that brings us to Canada, okay? The way these issues started first filtering, I think, into the Canadian political and media consciousness was talk about the SIMS database, which became a little bit infamous in the robocalls scandal, because vote suppressing robocalls were made based on information. This was found by a judge, based from information coming from the SIMS database. But the Conservative Party was far ahead of the other parties in the data game in terms of collecting information about voters in a database, organizing it, and making it accessible across the country to canvassers, riding associations, and candidates. So the Liberals have their own version. You can't see it that well there, but Liberalist. The NDP has Populist, and there's various stories in the media, usually behind the scenes, about whether the parties think the databases are working well, do they update the software. Speaking about the US, there are links in the US, so the Liberalist is closely related to some software used by the Democratic Party, right? Conservatives, similar software that used by the Republican Party. So these databases now hold enormous amounts of information and are staples of right, if you're going to Canadian politics, if you're going to start a new party today and you want to be successful, you would have a database, right? That would be one of the first things you would start doing. So this is a screenshot from Cambridge Analytica, which is one of the big important data companies in the US especially. Okay, and so what do the parties do with all this data? Why do they want it? Okay, and part of the reason why they want it is to predict behavior. Okay, tying into those more traditional ways of politics like get out the vote and the air war. So they will assign voters scores, and Amìr will go into this a bit more, right? They'll assign voters scores, right? And so parties have scarce resources, right? And they're limited in how much they can spend by the Canada Elections Act, right? So how do they deploy those scarce resources? No point spending your time trying to persuade someone who will never vote for your party, right? And probably no point spending time trying to persuade someone who's already going to vote for your party, right? Always has, right? You may want to spend your resources trying to get that person who's going to vote for you to the polls, right? And this kind of predictive model can help you do that, and the information in the databases. But really what they're trying to do is target those voters who might be persuadable, right? Figure out what messaging will actually be useful, right? So that's the micro-targeting side, and the information that they're collecting is being used for those purposes and then others. So you click like, right? Congratulations on some accomplishment, right? And that gets fed into this information. You do something on Facebook, okay? Put something on Twitter. All that kind of information is there. When someone knocks on your door, right, and they ask you, you might say, yes, I'm willing to vote for this party, I will. You may say nothing, right? But they can infer things based on, right? Do you have kids' toys in your front lawn? Right? Do you live in a condominium or do you own the house? Right? So there's various information that feeds into the databases and how they use them. But micro-targeting is one. Getting out the vote is another. So what's the election law side of this? So in 2013, the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada flagged the lack of privacy protections on these databases as an important legal issue. Why did Mr. Mahon do that? Because this is effectively the only real piece of legislative material in the Canada Elections Act that addresses the privacy issue. It simply says, no person shall knowingly use personal information that is recorded in a list for a purpose other than essentially the regulated entities, right, the parties, other than for a federal election or a referendum. Okay? So the parties get information from the National Register of Electors, which contains the most basic information about voters, right? Your name, your date of birth, your address, right, is the core information. And the parties use that to communicate with voters. They collect other email addresses and other things and relevant information in other ways. So this simply says you can't misuse it, right? A political party can't start using the data they collect from the National Register of Electors for commercial purposes, right? To start making a ton of money in a kind of private corporate fashion, okay? But there's nothing in there about how data is to be stored, okay? Nothing in there are there other limits on its use besides this limit on has to be for a political purpose, okay? No limits on how it can be collected, essentially. And so the Canada Elections Act is supposed to be the comprehensive piece of legislation that addresses all aspects of political parties, okay? And started in the 70s, and we've seen in its modern form gradual evolution where the Elections Act covered very little. Parties were largely unregulated, and now the Act is quite comprehensive. It covers leadership races, nomination races, auditing, finances, internal party operations, even to a large extent. Okay? Robocalls are now included after the Fair Elections Act, right? But does not really address privacy concerns. So that is one of the new areas that the Act will need to, I think, be updated to include. The Minister of Democratic Institutions, right? Famously, we have a new minister. Moving to a proportional representation system is not on the agenda. Okay? The government releases now the mandate letters for ministers. So the mandate letter for the new minister says a number of things about third party, campaign finance, election spending. Okay? But at the top was about cybersecurity. Okay? And so why would cybersecurity be at the top of the mandate letter, right? Electoral activities free from hackers, okay? Communicating and working together with the various communications and intelligence agencies. Why do that? We don't have electronic voting in Canada. That was one of the things the Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Reform considered. Rejected it mainly because of security concerns, okay? But security concerns find their way to the top of the agenda here because Elections Canada holds important information that could be subject potentially to hacking, and the political parties hold important and sensitive information, right? So the Democratic Party was hacked in the US very famously, right? Same thing could potentially happen to the parties here, okay? The parties have voluntary policies that they adhere to. They all post them on their websites, but we don't know how robust those are really. We don't know if they enforce them. We don't know if they've been hacked in the past and we've just never heard about it, okay? Because the normal privacy mechanisms are that would apply to public and private sector entities, and other private and public sector entities are not there. The disputes we know about that have come up, there was an incident where the Conservative Party mailed holiday greeting cards, right, to people of various religious faiths, and it was people were upset because it was unclear how anyone had identified them based on their religion, right? How the party gained that information, okay? And that happened on one occasion. Quite dramatic. I don't know how many people are here from BC and closely follow BC politics, but the BC Provincial Liberal Party website was allegedly hacked, okay? And the Premier of British Columbia then claimed that it was done by the opposition, the New Democratic Party. Okay, we haven't seen evidence of who did the hacking, but it seems that likely that hacking did occur. So the integrity of party databases from a bunch of different potential aggressors is a protection from a bunch of different potential aggressors is an important issue, and I think recognized in a sort of indirect way by the mandate letter. So the problem generally is privacy protections on all this data that political parties hold. Now I'll turn it over to my colleagues to go into detail about some of the law and technology and privacy issues. Thank you.
Good morning. When I was first invited by Professor Judge and Professor Powell to act as a research assistant for this project, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. They asked me if I knew what all of this meant, and I politely nodded my head. But deep down, I was thinking, well, big data is used in several different contexts. I mean, it's used, it's oftentimes overused, and many times it's misused. But you know, seeing big data being inaugurated into politics seemed like a natural step. So then I got to the research, and that's when I tried to, you know, having a non-tech background, I tried to subordinate the technology to its instrumental effectiveness. And from there, I wanted to see what this technology actually does. And from there, I realized that there are some serious democratic implications. Now, in doing the research, I quickly came to two very important realizations. A, the Canadian political landscape and the technology within it is heavily influenced by the United States and the American landscape. In 2008 and 2012, Barack Obama ran a very enthusiastic campaign, and that proliferated the technology. And what we saw in 2015, used by the Canadian political parties, the Liberals specifically, was very similar to the technology that was used by Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. And furthermore, what we realized is that the American political parties also give the technology that fuels their databases to their Canadian counterparts. So the Democrats gave the Liberal Party their software to use for their political party database. Similarly, we saw the Republicans doing the same with the Conservative Party here in Canada as well. So that's when I came to the conclusion that I had to really canvass the American landscape. Luckily, as Professor Powell mentioned, there was an election recently in the United States, the presidential election and the primaries that preceded it. From there, we learned a lot of information with respect to the technology. Now, the second very important fact was that we realized how important and how influential the private sector is in all of this. Private sector data intermediaries, data brokers, aggregators are heavily involved in the aggregation of voter data. So data that was initially used for consumer behavior analysis, now being converted to draw inferences with respect to voter data. So let's begin with what we understand to be a very traditional behavioral, consumer behavioral data analysis. Somebody is within a certain age, occupation, level of education, whatever it may be, and from there they can draw all types of inferences with respect to the types of advertising they would like to see at a specific hour, at a specific time, during a specific television show. Next thing you know, they're buying a Volkswagen Jetta. Now, you can convert that to voter data as well. So similarly, same biographical traits applied to these individuals, and we know who is affiliated with which party, or is likely to be affiliated with which party, liberals, conservatives, so forth and so on. But things have changed since then. Now, data is virtually everywhere. digital data, digital traces, telecommunications, mobile, your internet use, your social media use. And it's with this data that everything has become far more nuanced. And so with these multiple layers of complexities, it appears as though the political parties themselves may not be sophisticated enough to actually analyze this data. So that's where the data brokers come in, one of which is Cambridge Analytica, which is trumpeting itself as the, yeah, no pun intended, as the company that helped Donald Trump ease to victory, including Aristotle, Nation Builder. Some of these are Canadian, some of these are American, but we do know that to some extent they are all involved in converting consumer behavioral data into voter data. So, allow me to demonstrate. So, kindly forgive the crudity of this model. I mean, my Excel and PowerPoint skills only go so far. But Amìr Korhani, he's an eligible voter, all right? Basic biographical traits: gender, male, student, not married, 0 children. All right. He likes to watch, whatever, Brady Bunch. His favorite app may be Pokemon or the new Mario. He enjoys reading Vice magazine, shops at the Gap, drives a Volkswagen, etc. and so forth. So then, ethnicity, sexual orientation, income. Again, these little bits and pieces of information are become far more intrusive. But here, in the third section, now that's where it gets interesting. Facebook. How many friends does he have? How extroverted is he? LinkedIn. What type of industry is he involved in? How intelligent could he possibly be? Instagram. Does he constantly post pictures of food or whatever the trend is these days? Is he neurotic, right? And again, neurotic is not meant in the pejorative sense. It's a trait that they look for. Now that's the psychometric profiling that is far more controversial than what we've seen in the first and second rows. But you know what? He recently retweeted the fact that he was at the rally of the Higher Living Party. So now, from all of this information, we can deduce that his political affiliation is part of the independent party. Or he's just an independent. He just does not care to vote for liberals or the conservatives. But who cares, you ask? Because anyone can broadcast their political affiliation these days anyway. So it's not extremely revealing to think that somebody's political affiliation is now posted somewhere in somebody's database. But that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for this. His final score. Amìr Korhani scores at a -15. And he could only score between -15 or +15, which means that whoever this database belongs to, let's say the Liberal Party of Canada, there is no way on earth that he'll ever vote for the Liberals, because he scores at a -15. So, as a Liberal Party politician, as a campaigner, you're thinking to yourself, I have a finite amount of resources. Am I going to send my canvassers out to this man's door? Well, the answer is no. Am I going to call him? The answer is no. Am I going to send him micro-targeted messages? The answer is no. Why? Because he scores at a -15. He's not worth my time. He's not worth the message. He's been excluded from the political discourse. Conversely, if I were at a +15, the same might hold true as well, because I'm a sure bet. There's no way on earth that I'm not voting for the Liberals. So, in all likelihood, I could be excluded from the political discourse in that sense as well. Again, please note that two important things. A, the final score is different for each political party database, which means that for the Liberals, I might score at a -15. For the Conservatives, with the same biographical data and the analysis, I might score at a 1 or a 2 or whatever it may be. And furthermore, this is just a small little replica of what we believe the political party databases look like. So this is only 20 pieces of information as opposed to what we believe to be thousands and thousands accumulated by the political parties, as well as the data brokers that assist them. So, Professor Judge and Professor Powell are also implicated in all of this. This is not just my digital dossier. Everything I do affects or impacts them as well. How, you ask? So this is the Donald Trump app. I downloaded it during the election season. And from here, we can almost guess what kind of technology we're going to see in 2019 from well, the conservatives or the liberals. So it's very basic, straightforward stuff. It's nothing extraordinary. You have to share your views on Twitter, share on Facebook. But when I first signed up for the app, I was asked whether or not I want to share my contact list. If I clicked yes, then all of you, well, whoever is on my telephone, would also be part of the Donald Trump database. As well as with my Facebook contacts as well. But then I thought, well, this project is so interesting. What I want to do is show my appreciation to Professor Judge and Professor Powell. So I tried to purchase the official inauguration 16-ounce cups from the Donald Trump campaign. Except I couldn't do that unless I provide the name of my employer as well as their occupation. So Professor Judge and Professor Powell would be on this as well, simply because I wanted to purchase these cups for them. So my acquaintances would also be somehow, even without having a Facebook account or a LinkedIn account or taking precautionary measures with respect to their digital traces, somehow they would be implicated in this as well, and somehow their names would enter into the Donald Trump database. Just on a side note, in the interest of maintaining political independence, as an ethical researcher, I also tried to download the Hillary Clinton app. However, it's not available in Canada. So what does all this mean? What do they do with all this data? We know they collect it. We know that there's a score associated with everyone, or assigned to everyone. But this is what they do with it. So these are basic banner ads that you might see when you're browsing through Google or Facebook or any other website for that matter. I'm with her, vote Bernie, etc. and so forth. So for now, this is what we're going to keep seeing. However, as the technology, more technology or more sophisticated technology emerges, we're going to see far more nuanced and I personally identified messages and banners. So that's what we call micro-targeting, micro-targeted ads. So, for instance, on the Hillary Clinton app or on the Hillary Clinton database, say I score as a positive 13, 14. So in this case, she's no longer sending me advertising that talks about the issues, economics, the environment, whatever it may be. She's encouraging me to go out and vote early. She knows I'm a sure bet. She just wants to guarantee the vote. Similarly, I could say the same about the Donald Trump. So now he knows that I'm going to vote for him. I'm cast at a positive 10 or whatever it may be. And so he's asking me to donate in order to have dinner with Donald Trump. I must say, the apps are great. For any aspiring politicians out there, you should definitely get an app because they are riotously amusing. And so again, conversely, if I scored at a negative 15 or whatever it may be, I wouldn't even be seeing any of these ads. Or converse, one more thing, if I'm scoring at, let's say, a negative 2 or negative 3 for Donald Trump on the Donald Trump database, odds are he's no longer sending me messages saying, go vote for me. He's sending me messages to not vote for Hillary Clinton. So he's expecting me to not vote at all. So yeah, there you have it. And that's what the technology looks like, and that's how they use the data. I'll give it to Professor Judge now.
Okay, So the most obvious way that one might think to protect this personal information, which is held by parties, is privacy legislation. But as Professor Powell mentioned, that seems to be sort of a black box of nothingness. So the standard privacy legislation is based on fair information principles. So principles like the person has the ability to consent whether the information is collected or not. They have the information to see if the information is accurate. They can, the principle is that you would limit the use for which it was initially collected and not go beyond that. You provide safeguards like to prevent security breaches, etc. Okay, so that all sounds good and potentially useful. But the problem is that our two main pieces of federal legislation both leave out political parties, but for different reasons. So the Privacy Act is our federal act that governs the public sector, which is defined as government. And political parties are specifically excluded from the definition of government. Okay, so then we turn to the private sector legislation, PIPEDA, and that governs commercial activities, but political campaigns and elections are not commercial activities. Now, it's possible that the third-party data brokers would be included as commercial activities, but interestingly, a number of privacy scholars think that that would not be the case. So if third-party data brokers are selling their databases to political parties, that would be excluded as well. Okay, so given this gap, what might we do? What's in this mix from our fortune teller here of the information? And so the reform would really need to tackle several problems. First is several jurisdictional questions. So would it be national or provincial legislation? One problem is that the parties at the provincial and the federal level often have data sharing agreements. So it isn't really clear that there's a distinction, a clear-cut distinction between federal versus provincial data. The other problem is whether or not Canadian legislation would even be very effective if it did apply. So these third-party data brokers are for the most part in the US, and they're storing and the processing the data there and would be subject for those activities to Canadian legislation. The second problem jurisdictionally is whether it would come, if it were to be amended, with the Privacy Commissioner or the Elections Officer. Again, there's a jurisdictional problem in determining whether this is really an electoral issue or a privacy commissioner issue. So far, the privacy commissioner seems not to want jurisdiction over this, or at the very least, thinks that there's no possibility that they currently have jurisdiction over it. Which leaves us with self-regulation, but that's what we have right now. And that's been not very useful at all. So the parties do have privacy policies, but the privacy policies aren't very clear. It isn't clear if it's simply applying to their websites or if it's applying to all of their activities. Another option would be to amend the existing legislation to include political parties. And we have an example of that with the BC Personal Information Protection Act. In their legislation, political parties are not excluded because it doesn't have the commercial activities criterion. So there, everything is picked up if it's a person, an unincorporated association, a trade union, a trust, or a not-for-profit organization. Now, it doesn't include MLAs once they're elected, but presumably it could be used, and a lot of scholars seem to think that's a possibility, at least to regulate the parties and the campaigns. Okay. But we also have further problems with applying the fair information principles as a panacea. So even if we were to try to amend the legislation by opposing fair information principles, It would give individuals the right to know what information is being collected about them. It would give individuals the right to know that that information was secure. But in this case, knowing the information is not nearly the whole thing. What you would want to know is what inferences are being made about that, and that's not clearly covered by the fair information principles. Moreover, the limitation of the purpose criterion perhaps wouldn't be nearly as effective in this context as it would be for a private sector corporation that's selling books or cars or blenders. Okay, so with a nod to Rumsfeld here. So our known knowns are known unknowns and our unknown unknowns. Okay, so this is a big reason why it's really difficult to come up with legislation that would apply to fix this problem. So we know that there's big data collection, we know that the parties have databases, we know that there are third-party data brokers involved, and we know that they're engaged in some form of micro-targeting. But we don't yet know to any precision what type of inferences are being made, how nuanced they are, how discrete they are. We don't know the extent of the data per person. We don't know the precision of the micro-targeting or how effectively it's being used. We don't know the types of messages or whether it continues to be used off-season by the parties when there's no election. And we don't know, obviously, what we don't know. When we were doing these slides, I was getting mixed up and I kept telling Amìr, you gotta write down the unknown unknowns. And he was like, I can't. Right. Which is our big issue here. So the purpose limitation might not be very limiting. It's hard to think what wouldn't potentially be useful for parties to know, to be able to predict whether someone is voting. Okay, so this leads us to a number of democratic problems. So the first democratic conundrum is that there's a tension between the secrecy of the vote and the idea that elections and campaigning is public. Okay, so we've got this secret public problem. One political scholar has said that secrecy has become the general standard, and a country in which it is widely violated will be judged as lacking free and fair elections. Okay, so contrast that secrecy with the democratic dialogue. So contrasted with the secret vote, you've got the desirability for an open dialogue between candidates and the voters. I like the guy's Cookie Monster shirt. So candidates can shape the voters' views, and voters can shape the candidates' views. And so we are intending that to be a mutual conversation where both are persuadable as part of the electoral process. So as one U.S. political scientist commented, we aren't going to win over voters by educating them, let alone berating them for having opinions we disagree with. Just because they disagree with us doesn't mean they're ignorant or stupid. My sense is we win voters over by listening to them, empathizing with their experiences, if not their beliefs, and gently highlighting the things they say that cohere with our own beliefs and experiences. Okay, so in other words, it's a standard part of the political process that candidates use this dialogue and exchange with voters to learn about them, but voters also learn about the candidates in the process. So given that, are technologies and big data really doing anything new other than what we've always had with this open process and dialogue in the electoral process? Well, one major change is that voters are no longer controlling what is being told to candidates about them. So if they knock on your door, you decide to tell them, if you went to the movies and what you saw. Most people probably wouldn't be saying that, but they're getting that type of psychometric information and making inferences about it with the new technologies. So the democratic implications for this, and the different version of what Professor Powell and Professor upgraded you there, and Amìr were talking about. So it's these inferences that are perhaps the most significant aspect of big data and the personalization of politics. So again, this is an image from the SIMS database, but it's likely other databases are using very similar types of spectrums. So this information about voters has been analyzed to see if they're likely to be voting and if they're likely to vote for that party or that candidate. The inferences, of course, make campaigning more efficient. Who's the best bet to spend your money on, who's likely to vote, and who's likely to vote for you. But over time, as micro-targeting becomes more detailed and crowds out the general messaging, some people may not hear a party's message at all, and some people may hear only a partial message because they may be micro-targeted to magnify a particular part of the party's platform to the exclusion of other issues. Okay, so I'm going to pop it back to Professor Powell for the last slide.
So we did just want to add one more piece of information before we go to all your questions. So bringing the election law side back in, there's a series of cases where the Supreme Court of Canada has upheld what's been called the egalitarian model of elections, that the Canada Elections Act tries to level the playing field between parties, some of whom have large amounts of resources and others who have less. Right, so spending limits in election campaigns, contribution limits, how much you can donate to a party or a candidate is limited. Those are all parts of the egalitarian model. And the Supreme Court of Canada said those are limits on political expression, limits on constitutionally protected speech, but that are justifiable as long as the amounts that can be spent or donated are reasonable. So in a case called, how is that relevant here to privacy and big data politics? There's a case called R.V. Bryan, because there was a provision in the Elections Act that made it an offense to prematurely transmit election results from the east coast of the country before the polls had closed in the west, right? Just because of the time zones. Then the justification was people who are voting in Newfoundland will not know anything about the results, won't know how their fellow citizens have voted, whereas people in BC might have a really good idea of how the election's going to turn out if they know how people in Ontario voted. Okay? And that informational equality, that creates informational inequality, which is problematic. The Fair Elections Act actually, one of the positive things it did was to take out that provision of the Canada Elections Act, right? It doesn't make sense in the kind of Twitter or Facebook era, right, to make it an offense to post information about election results across the country. Okay? But the court in the Bryan case, which had upheld the constitutionality of that provision prior to its repeal, said informational equality is one of the constitutional principles that applies in assessing cases that involve elections and limitations on political expression. So relevant here, does the principle of informational equality mean in the same way that campaign spending and advertising is limited? Should parties' ability to spend on their big data operations be limited? Does informational equality require some privacy protections? Right, so it could be from the BC legislation or the other federal legislation or the fair information principles that we draw a new approach. It could also be derived from the constitutional principle of informational equality that could be put into legislation. So we just wanted to flag that for you, that the way the Canada Elections Act has operated and the democratic rights provisions has been to try to create a level playing field, right, in spending in other areas. What would it mean to create a level playing field here in big data politics? So we kind of throw that out as an important question going forward. So thanks for your attendance and attention, and we look forward to your questions. I don't think we need microphones, so just raise your hands. Yes, we've got one over there.
Hi. So my question is with regards to the political parties themselves. Do you know how much they trust this information and data? So for example, let's say 20 years ago it was, oh, you're homosexual, clearly you're not going to vote for this party, done. But now 20 years later, it doesn't matter, right? The people will vote for whichever person they want to. So let's say you have a really niche issue. All you care about is Canada's position on Turkey. And you will vote for anyone who supports your position on Turkey. and Turkey's not big in the news that year, so it's not a big impact. But then the next election cycle, suddenly it is a big impact, and every party has a position on this. So how much do they trust this micro information, given that it may change between years?
Maybe I'll start. I think it's an iterative process, right? They're probably going to trust it more in the next election than they did in the one that just happened. We don't know what happens necessarily inside parties, so it's a hard question to answer from that point of view. But if you think of the evolution, right? Bill Clinton was in the news in his campaign in the 90s, right? It was the idea that he was appealing to the quote-unquote soccer moms, right? That was the degree of sophistication of the targeting, right? People drove minivans and drove their kids to soccer, right? That was so now they have thousands of data points, as Amìr pointed out. So that would imply they'd likely have more confidence in it, but we don't know exactly. They're doing their internal evaluations. We know that people get up in the press and say, well, people I work for won, right? So that shows the effectiveness of the operation, but we don't really know how effective all the data was.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, I think it's certainly a big bump for Cambridge Analytica that their candidate won using these techniques of micro-targeting that they're promoting. And they're certainly trying to exploit that now with other campaigns.
I would just add that I think political parties right now would have to play it safe. Better to be safe than sorry, and try to send out banners and ads to whoever they can. But as we see that the micro-targeting is becoming more and more sophisticated, and it's in a constant state of evolution. And what we'll see in 4 years is not what we're seeing right now. So all these different biographical traits will come into effect. At this juncture, I think they have all this data, and they're just, perfecting it, the analysis that is.
Do you think that political parties are encouraging corporations and businesses to take political stances so they can more effectively micro-target voters?
I think so. It's hard to know because we don't know exactly what the nature of the inferences are that they're making, but that seems to be a logical leap in the argument to think that this is going to work this is going to work to affect what they do in terms of their campaign platforms. The more precise the information they have about us, the more they can sort of reflect it back and become winnable.
Well, some of these data intermediaries are politically agnostic. To them, money is money. They don't really care who they side with, but some have taken certain political positions and only serve the mandates or the agenda of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. But we do know that they are very, very influential in all of this, especially in the United States, where this has been vertically integrated as part of their product line. So if you go onto their website, you'll see a specific section that says, we are selling and analyzing voter data. So.
Is there a way to know how they make those inferences? For example, like behavior A will lead to decision B. Like right now, it's just a black box. Is there a way to know if it's a machine or?
Well,
Go ahead.
well, it's a special algorithm that we haven't seen. We haven't. Nobody really knows how this is being done, but we do know that. Well, recently there was a psychologist that did an OCEAN test. So OCEAN stands for openness, C stands for something else, E stands for extroversion, A stands for aggression, and N stands for neuroticism. And so from there, they can pretty much, they know exactly whether or not your parents, for example, have been divorced and how old you were when they were divorced. So they use, so their algorithms are quite sophisticated. Are they, how precise they are and how reliable they are at this juncture, we don't know. But we do know that there is a certain level of sophistication that the regular Joe just cannot duplicate.
I mean, I think that there's also a number of correlations that have been studied, which are being linked to political affiliations. So, I mean, some of them would be obvious. Vegetarians are more likely to vote Democratic. But then they also pair it with, people who shop at the Gap are more likely to do this. And people who have golden retrievers are more likely to vote this way. People who watch the show Blue Bloods are overwhelmingly Republican. So I mean, they have done it on sort of a one-to-one basis with different movies, shows, food, pets, etc.
Yeah, there's not a ton of literature on this. Susan Delacour's book, I think, goes into the most detail, and she did interviews with political parties and candidates and MPs, and people use the databases. So that's the most direct source of a lot of the information about what goes on. But that's because they voluntarily chose to reveal, how they're using these databases, right? So it's a tough kind of set of information to get at as researchers.
I mean, it's interesting, and there's maybe even a bit of a grain of salt that we could see from the most recent U.S. election in terms of what was predicted and what happened and who was reading the tea leaves in different ways and sort of where data analytics played in and where micro-targeting played in and that sort of. So it's like in some ways we're seeing also like a bit of a trending one way, but then realizing, a correction another way, and there's like, synthesis that happens. We see it sort of from one electoral cycle to another where, I mean, as you were saying, in 2008 and 2012, the Democrats were really on top of their data analytics and their management. They were sort of ahead of the game. Before that, the Republicans had been sort of ahead of the game. And I mean, the most recent election, we had to sort of dig deeper to see sort of what sort of organization there was, because by all accounts there wasn't as much organization, and the Republicans have invested a lot in terms of what they are doing. But in terms of sort of, you were talking about as well in terms of how you know, and sort of Elizabeth, we were talking about, the correlations. You totally see it. Anybody who still watches, I don't know if anybody still watches cable TV anymore. If you do, like if you are watching a sports show, if you're watching like the Super Bowl, there'll be certain types of ads, I mean also the special Super Bowl ads, but if you're watching like a basketball game or a hockey game, you'll get more ads that are for video games, you'll get more ads for like Euro games, you'll get more ads that are targeted to a certain demographic, whereas I watch a lot of home and garden television, like real estate TV, and it's all like new parenting ads, Packers, Huggies, like, and how do they know that I have 2 little children? It's by what you watch, by what you see, and by what you do too, it's like they're making those correlations and then making those correlations, especially like exactly what you eat, how you affiliate. So much of how we affiliate is online now. But everybody does have to reach out because there's overlap. And I have a question actually on that. Do you find that in this age of increased data analytics and increased capacity that there's almost like a, boom bust echo, like that there's a recognition that there's a law almost of diminishing returns with regard to data analytics, and that stuff needs to be rethought or is being rethought in order to stay relevant, or, where are the trend lines going in that way?
Yeah. I mean, because I think there's potentially a gap that the collection of information outstrips the ability to analyze it, but your ability to analyze it will move ahead. But I mean, you're always going to sort of get more data points as you do that. So I think you're quite right. Like right now, they can't analyze it to the extent of the amount of information that they have, but that's going to move.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that. Yes, surely. I mean, well, it's just that it's far more nuanced than that now. It's not just about which television show you watch and how many children you have. Now we know how open-minded you are, how extroverted you are, and things of that nature. So, that all plays into it as well. And again, it's not something that we've seen or something that we can duplicate through an Excel spreadsheet, but it's something that we should all be cognizant of.
I mean, it's kind of reminiscent of there's a really lengthy and robust debate in the political science literature about do political ads actually work or not, right? Do you actually persuade anybody or not? Right? But all the parties do them, right? And they all do them because they think they work. So to say, well, maybe ads don't work, therefore we're not going to regulate them at all, right? That doesn't seem like a very satisfactory response. So a lot of questions about effectiveness about big data in politics. So I don't know how effective they are now, but the parties definitely think it's important, and so they're going to continue to operate with with that in mind. So some people would say, how are elections decided? It's based on GDP growth over the previous 4 years, and if GDP growth is enough, then the person gets reelected, right? And there's lots of fundamentals models of politics like that. But maybe the strategy matters. So if the strategy matters, the big data part is going to continue to be a focus of the parties.
And are they using these databases while they're in office? Are they framing policy based on whoever they know will one day vote for them again in the next election? So these are other questions. I mean, this is not just something that they would be using for election season, but off season as well, right?
Well, that's sort of a huge thing because you see every political party sending out all the time fundraising calls, sign this petition, come to this thing, which they're using as sort of issue gauges and data collection gauges.
I mean, the theory of privacy regulation presumably wouldn't turn on whether they were doing it well or not. So, if they're collecting the information but then making really bad inferences, it's still a privacy issue, right?
Exactly.
You had a question? Oh, yes.
It was curious that you said when you downloaded the app, it asked you if you would share your Facebook info and your contacts. Because whenever I download an app, it's like all or nothing. We want these things, take it or leave it. So I'm curious if you think that is because of privacy legislation or elections law, or some other bizarre reason. Like, wouldn't they just want to get all your information like every other app developer? Why would they actually give you the option to opt out? And I guess it's a two-part question, that, and then if they do get your information, or if they get my information, I say, sure, you can have all my contacts, and Chelsea is in my contacts, but all of a sudden, she's kind of part of the database, whether she likes it or not, and the implications that fall from there. Comment on both of those.
Well, that's exactly what I was getting at, right? So even if Chelsea has no Facebook account or takes every precautionary measure to ensure that her digital traces or digital footprints are not traced, regardless, based on your actions, she is now part of the Donald Trump database, right? Similarly, as if I were to purchase something for Professor Judge or Professor Powell, same story. Why do I have the option? I don't know. Perhaps they're just being friendly at this stage, or maybe.
Yeah, right.
Well, it could very well be. I mean, it could be a customer satisfaction issue. Maybe some people are very, very adamant about not wanting to share their Facebook contact list or whatever. So I really don't know, but I could envision future apps that don't ask you or give you an option or a choice whatsoever.
I mean, it could just be a ruthless calculation that it's better to get information about you than information about no one. And most people might be pretty willing to give over their contacts, so why not pick up the small percentage of people that don't want to do it?
I would say that most people will say, okay, download anyway, so that the statistics suggest otherwise. That's why I was really curious.
I almost did, but then I thought no.
I mean, the whole use of apps is new, right? Apps are used in Canadian politics by the parties to get information door to door, but the idea that the parties would have apps that voters would voluntarily, right, download and use, that's a new thing. So this is a great project. We were all learning lots. That was one of the things that I learned about. And I think Amìr left out the most interesting detail of the Donald Trump app, which was like they rank you based on your participation, and the top level was Patriot or
No, I reached
Apprentice.
Patriot. I reached Patriot.
You reached Patriot.
The next was the Trump train, taking a ride on the Trump train, and then the last stage would have been Apprentice. Yeah, so I only got 1,100 points, but it was a lot of fun, I must say. It's the new bumper. It's really the new bumper sticker of political support, right? So
Question at the back there.
It seems like there's a clear gap in the legislation and the law's ability to protect the privacy interests of people who are willingly or unwillingly having their data collected and analyzed by these political parties. But it also seems like there's little incentive for the political parties to do anything about that. So when you become the government, where is the political will? If there's a consensus that this is a real problem and gap in the privacy and elections law, how do we deal with it?
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot of incentive to fix it, much like electoral reform.
Realistically, wouldn't there be a negative incentive to fix it if you form the government?
I mean, it's a general problem in election law that parties have political interests or partisan interests, but they're the ones designing the law, right? That applies in campaign finance, right? That's why we have gerrymandering. It's not an issue in Canada, but in other countries. But where we found solutions to it, it's because they've been institutional ones, right? So we don't have gerrymandering because independent commissions do it. So, the Chief Electoral Officer in Elections Canada is the relevant independent institution here. They've recommended changes. Recommendations of the CEO don't always get put in place, but they're often quite influential. There's a House committee that's slated to study the issue, so there's potentially some movement. I could actually see an argument that the parties should want to put in privacy protections, because at some point there's likely to be a hack, there's likely to be a breach. They probably want to be able to say to those people who are upset by the breach, who've had their information disclosed, look, we did everything we were supposed to do, we did the best we could. Right, and so I don't know what'll come out of the mandate letter, but that's one of the broader, right? If you're gonna take cybersecurity seriously, then the privacy protection is not the exact same issue, but it's very closely related. So there might be some momentum there. So sometimes in reaction to scandal or evolving policy concerns or public expectations, the parties take action in the election law sphere, and this could be one of those areas.
And depending on who your base is, right? Because some bases are very, very paranoid about the government having their information, right?
Right, there's the pirate part, right? There's parties that are based around internet issues in other countries. Maybe that would become something here. I don't know enough about people's political beliefs on that, but that there's always potential for it to become a political issue.
But when confronted with this issue, you could see politicians, as you mentioned, exercising some sort of reflexive solidarity, in the sense that they would all, try to reach a consensus as to how they want to manage this. My prediction would be that they want to reject any type of change, any type of reform, because these political databases are becoming increasingly important to winning elections. But that said, at this juncture, the only thing that we as a people can do is just to raise awareness and see what happens.
I've never heard people get quite so angry as in the midst of the whole robocalls issue, the investigation after that. That wasn't enough to spur serious sort of thought about it at the political level. And then at provincial level in Ontario, the entire electoral database, the entire electoral data roll was stolen from Ontario elections a few years ago. Again, there's no ramifications, no fallout from the investigations. The track record for reform isn't very good, despite data. So data breaches are not triggered. I think it's people being openly and actively annoyed that they're being manipulated is what's the trigger.
So I'm fascinated by the use of technology to micro-target people. So I'm wondering, I guess Amìr might be the best person to introduce into this section. Did you come across any research about people using technology to game the algorithm?
I personally haven't seen any of that. That's a very, very good question. I don't know if people know enough about it to actually try to game the algorithm.
I'm doing that, actually.
Are you really?
Yes.
Then perhaps you'd like to contribute to this.
Don't underestimate subterfuge. If you think somebody is looking for information you don't want to divulge, I'm perfectly happy to lie. Remember a number of survey panels. I'm happy to tell them, what kind of car I drive. But they're going to ask me things like political meanings, which I don't think should be part of a survey. I'll make up something.
Like, I'm wondering if you could have 2 or 3 Facebook profiles. One is your true identity, another one for when you want to cross the border, to give your password apparently, and another one for behavioral.
How feasible is that? At what point do you realize that there's nothing you can do with respect to this type of technology? Because your digital footprints and your traces, they're everywhere.
But it's using the technology to counter that.
Well, good luck with that, but I don't think it's going to happen. And if it does, it's only one amongst millions and millions of people who actually tries and perhaps succeeds. But
I mean, some of this stuff is brand new because of the technology, and some of it is just politics manifest in a different way, right? If you ever knock door to door for a party, some of the people will say, yes, I'll vote for that party that you represent, just to get you off their doorstep, right? Or because they don't want to, and so that came up in the robocalls, right? That where people actually honestly self-identifying, because then they were targeted by vote suppressing calls, right? That was part of it. Was it the database had gotten people's political affiliations wrong because there was a coding error or something? So these kind of issues have come up already, but we're also there in the past with the older techniques of politics, knocking on the door. Do you support this party or not? I don't want to tell you. Okay, I'll tell you just so you go away, right? That's been a long-standing feature of politics. I think we had Professor Geis.
No, I was just going to quickly say to Chelsea's point, Helen Nissenbaum wrote a book on obfuscation, which is exactly this. And it's about a 100-page book that goes through how you throw sand in the gears in the sense of a lot of the data mining that takes place. I think there's actually, I know there's a large number of people do it, but I think there's a cohort that put out, who understand how you can put in all sorts of crap that throws off the algorithm.
Yep.
My question relates to the potential for data perhaps off-season. So my colleague here mentioned that the government doesn't have the incentive, for instance, to, put in privacy measurements to protect people's privacy. But to what extent, I guess, does the data have potential to be used by the government, for instance, to tell a citizen, to inform a citizen of services that are available to them in their community that are relevant to them? So take, for instance, a profile of a male who is single or divorced and has 3 children and has an income bracket of X amount of dollars. Can that data be used to tell him on his profile that, this after-school activity is subsidized by the government in your community, or, these are things that, your money, your taxes are paying for? Can that be considered good governance even?
I mean, it used to be the most advanced new technology was public opinion polling, right? And so governments would sit around and say, well, look, now we can actually know what people think. Do they like this policy or not, right? So the idea that governments, and not just the parties, would use the technology is, they're using other types of technology. Why not? Would the government itself have its own database about people, right? So in theory, there's supposed to be a separation between what MPs do as MPs and what they do as candidates. They're not supposed to use the House of Commons resources for partisan purposes. So that would theoretically include collecting data about voters in their ridings. I think that's probably honored more in the breach, right? That kind of rule. Like, you can see how there's not a strict separation there always. But in theory, there could be some benefits, but the downside is if you're just micro-targeting, right? Are you actually facilitating a conversation among voters? What are the deliberative implications? You're only telling people what they want to hear, never providing information that they need to know. So there's a bunch of deeper questions that I don't think we have gone through necessarily in our research so far, because we've been focusing on the privacy issue, but that your question very rightly brings up, and I think there should be more work on. Everybody in this room, anybody who's interested, I think there's lots of research that can happen in this area.
But I think there's also a very central point to your question, which is, if we know more about the people, can we govern them better, right? And the answer to that is no, because this information was not volunteered. And let's not forget that privacy is a fundamental part of our functioning democracy. And so when you're engaged or approached by canvassers, telephone calls, surveys, town halls, whatever it may be, you're volunteering intelligent conversation or intelligent facts that you believe to be relevant to the discussion at hand. So the democratic discourse is not the type of discourse or the same discourse that you're having with your husband or your wife or your children or your friends on Facebook or whoever that may be. That's a completely different conversation, and that has nothing to do with the issues that are focused on by the politicians. Do you see the distinction there? Yes.
I don't know, so maybe I just didn't misunderstand. So when they're collecting all this information, they're collecting it from like Facebook and all these places, private sectors, for example, that may be subject to PIPEDA if they're engaged in commercial activities. So these organizations too, are they doing the right thing, divulging that kind of information? So I don't know if you study like how much is coming from Facebook, how much is coming from these different entities that contribute to all this information that they're collecting, and if they're respecting privacy from that side, not just from the the election side, from the private sector that's feeding all this information? Because, you know, how is Facebook giving all this information? Are they collecting analytical data from Facebook? Is Facebook handing over this information? Or are they just going on, you know, random profiles and collecting? So like, I don't know how it's done really.
Yeah, so with third-party data brokers, I mean, they're seemingly operating within the privacy legislation, so they're collecting this information. Whether or not they're covered when they sell it to the political parties, I think is the open issue.
Yeah.
I mean, this type of information has been circulating for a long time in the consumer context.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to go back though to the idea about the government information. So I don't think it's true that all information that the government uses to regulate you is based on volunteered information. So, you know, there's the census, there's taxes, there's, you know, all sorts of information that they mandate that you supply to them in order for them to govern.
I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat a second. Isn't there, I missed the beginning, so maybe you already addressed this, but isn't there sort of this idea that if I have Uber on my phone and I therefore get cheap taxi service, I kind of know that they're probably mining my phone for other kinds of data when I have this app on my phone? I mean, isn't that kind of the deal of having all of this convenience and having a Google Maps, is that the FSB may know where I am at any point because they have access to Google Maps? I'm just putting that out there. Anyway.
So I guess if you download the app, it's like that, but what if you're just a citizen engaging in politics, right? Have you done the same thing as downloading, right, the party? So they're gathering information about you. I guess it's the consent point, right? So maybe there is some consent if you're downloading the app, but what if you're just wanting to exercise your democratic rights, right? And this information is being collected. The information is being collected. So is it exactly the same kind of relationship? I don't know.
And you know, there may be a related issue as to whether or not people are, you know, fully aware of all the information that they're giving when they download an app like the Trump app. So, you know, some of the political apps have geolocating attached to them. So, you know, are you fully aware that the parties are going to be following where you're making inferences based on your travel patterns?
This might also just be a generational thing too, because a lot of the young people that I talk to, we're just all like, yeah, well, we assume that they have all the data. I'm just assuming that they have all that data. If I don't want them to have it, I should not put anything at all anywhere on anything, right? Whereas my parents or other older people than them are quite often going like, well, what do you mean they know where I shop? I'm like, well, of course they know where you shop. Like, you have a phone, right? Like, you downloaded this thing. Of course they know where you shop. And I find it's a bit of a generational thing, and it makes them scared. Whereas for me, I'm like, well, yeah, what else?
And maybe there's different expectations if it's, you know, if you're clicking like on Facebook or putting something on Twitter, right? Whereas if you decide to eat at this, right, if you just have a coffee at Tim Hortons instead of a coffee at Starbucks, that tells people something about your likely political beliefs. Right? So that's a different kind of, are you going to change that behavior, right? Because you know they're going to use it. That's a different thing than, are you going to change your online participation where you might have a different kind of expectation about what will be used?
And there's things that are a little bit, I guess, harder to hide. So, you know, there's all sorts of studies that, you know, look at people's Instagram pages and make psychological assumptions about, well, you know, if this many portraits on there, that means you're extroverted versus, you know, somebody else, or most of your pictures are at night, you're probably depressed. So, you know, it's not like you can sort of change how you're going to choose the pictures. I mean, your inclination to choose pictures is sort of set, but they're, you know, making these inferences about it. Now, you know, maybe there's nothing to do about that in terms of regulation, but it is going to go on.
Good one.
Yes, actually, I do have one question. Before that, I just wanted to say about the Google thing. I think the key thing to remember about Google is we're the, what is it called? We're the good, you know, and like the good at their fun run to the advertisers, right? The advertisers are their customers, not us. But question to you guys about how they collect information per se. Now, I've never worked or I've never researched. I don't really know how these programs work. Now, would they work in something, in let's say an example such as this? Let's say they send you like you go to their website, right? Or they send you an email, and that email takes you to like a unique link, which then goes to their website, and they take your IP address, and then they take that IP address, they go to, let's say Facebook. Let's say if you have a fake name on Facebook, they buy bulk information from Facebook, tie that IP address to your Facebook. Is that kind of the how they research and how they get information? Like, how sophisticated is their data, and what's the extent?
It's basically what I described in the presentation. From what we know, they're just collecting data, like the way that you mentioned. So for instance, I share my score from the Trump app on Facebook. Professor Powell likes it, with the like button, right? From there, now they know that this is another potential supporter for the Trump app. So from just these little bits and pieces of likes and visits and subscribe to this, and even the petition. I get emails from Donald Trump asking me to sign petitions, especially with the recent court decision. But in doing so, I have to provide information, right? So just these little collection or acts of collection of data, which all just accumulate to, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 different bits and pieces of information. But how it works exactly, I can't tell you that. I really don't know.
Now, are they allowed to? No, I don't really know what's why I'm also worried. But like, would they be allowed to, let's say, install? Well, I doubt it, but to what extent do they want to do it? For instance, are they allowed to, let's say, install a certain very hidden malicious software to see where it goes? Like, can they go to that extent? And let's say if they can't, is it something they need to do anyway?
Well, they can geolocate you,
Yeah.
if that's what you're.
I think Susan Delacour's book makes it clear, whatever the most sophisticated commercial practices are around data gathering and analysis, the parties are trying to do the same thing. So they're just as sophisticated now as commercial advertisers or commercial product sellers. Probably last one, I think.
So, yeah, I remarked the legislative gap that you pointed out, but I wonder, even if you were to fill that gap to make it equivalent to what exists right now in the private sector, would that even really be enough? Because right now we know there's almost no way to hold other states accountable for what they're doing in terms of data breaches. It's very difficult to do that. Like espionage, for example, is legal, and even breaching a firewall is not an internationally wrongful act. So to what extent is it necessary to form treaties with other countries to be able to hold them accountable internationally for that type of breach beyond just domestic?
You're thinking of, like the Russia situation?
Exactly, like what Russia
Yeah.
did in Georgia and recently allegedly with the United States.
Yeah, I mean, so that's certainly not something that the privacy legislation domestically would fix. So yeah, I mean, that might be another option then to supplement it with information protection agreements between countries or something.
Okay, thank you everyone. Hope it was useful, and we appreciate your attendance on Friday.